Hello, this is Lilith, one of your IAs for BIBC 120, and this is the review video for Lecture 5. In Lecture 5, we started to talk about the sugar ingestion and the risks that come with it. The first topic that we covered was the fact that total sugar consumption has definitely increased over the years. And the sugar that we are talking about is sucrose, and sucrose is pictured right over here. Sucrose is made up of a monomer of glucose and fructose, and they have a glycosidic bond in between them, forming the disaccharide sucrose. And it's important to know that sucrose is a disaccharide because when later we talk about high fructose corn syrup, which is pictured right here, you will notice the difference that HFCS is not a disaccharide and it's just a mixture of two monosaccharides. And related to that, let's talk about the HFCH, high fructose corn syrup. High fructose corn syrup was industrialized to be a 50-50 mixture of glucose and fructose. And this is done by two enzymes, xylose isomerase and glucose isomerase. This is made from corn and it is used in many different foods in the industry, even foods that you would never think would have sugar in it. We covered that added sugar, sucrose, and high fructose corn syrup are linked to various diseases such as cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, stroke, and etc. Then we moved on to talk about artificial sweeteners. There are two types of artificial sweeteners that we talked about, sugar alcohols and non-nutritive sweeteners. These are also associated to obesity. And although they are good substitutes to sucrose or high fructose corn syrup, and they have about the same level of sweetness, they are, it is shown that they are not any healthier because they are associated with disease. Then we moved on to talk about fiber, and we talked about two types of fiber that exist, soluble and insoluble. Now, soluble fiber is distinct because it dissolves in water, whereas insoluble fiber does not dissolve in water. Both types of fibers are found to be good for us because they increase the bulk of the feces. It eases the passage of the bowel through our colon. It helps us have less risk of diverticulosis, and I will get to what that is in a second. Consuming fiber also helps us reduce the risk of diabetes because fiber is able to bind glucose in our digestive tract and slow down its absorption. So it reduces the risk of diabetes that way. Fiber reduces the risk of diabetes. Fiber reduces the risk of CVD, cardiovascular disease, and it does so by binding cholesterol and bile. Fiber also reduces the risk of obesity, and it also suppresses inflammation in the large intestine. And it does so by being a source of nutrition for the microbiome in our gut. The microbiome needs this source of nutrition, right? Needs this fiber so that they can also feed on something and produce side products that is going to be useful to us. Okay, so you can think of it as a symbiotic relationship between us and our microbiome. We give them a home, and if we eat fiber and good foods, then they also have food, and they are able to produce products, molecules that are actually useful for us and suppress inflammation in our colon. Now, let's go back to diverticulosis. Diverticulosis is when the colon forms these diverticula on the wall, on the muscle wall of the colon. And this usually takes place because if the bowel is not soft enough and the passage of the bowel through the colon is difficult, then the bowel ends up pushing on the sides of the walls too hard. And if there is a weak spot on the wall of the colon, then that kind of caves in to this blob, right? And this is not good, because if you think about it, there's a breakage in the muscle wall. And of course, even pieces of bowel can end up in the diverticula, and it would be very difficult to take them out. So this is a very common condition in especially elders. And it is definitely either avoidable or the risk is less if more fiber is consumed in the diet. Some of the research studies that we looked at fiber consumption and mouse models, and not just mouse models, sorry, just research studies. This one wasn't on mouse models, and this one was. So let's talk about this first one right here. So the first research study that we looked at was, can fiber act against breast cancer? And this was a meta-analysis. I will zoom in right here. You can see that there were many studies taken account in this meta-analysis. And this forest plot, here's one and here's another one, was built to show the relative risk of breast cancer if the individuals had consumed soluble fiber versus insoluble fiber. And according to these studies, it was shown that consuming soluble fiber reduced the relative risk, because see that the relative risk is at 0.75, so it has been reduced. Whereas consuming insoluble fiber still has a reduced relative risk, but it's not as big. So you see, this is how much the risk has been reduced. So not as much as consuming soluble fiber. Now, this is no means of saying that insoluble fiber isn't good for us, or it will not help in the cases of individuals who have breast cancer. This is just a meta-analysis and a collection of findings from 4 different studies. And of course, there may have been other studies that show different results, but just know that for this meta-analysis that we talked about, soluble fiber does seem to reduce relative risk more than insoluble fiber in terms of fighting against breast cancer. The second research study that we looked at was, can or does fiber work against airway allergic reactions that take place in asthma? And here are pictures of the airways of some mice. You can see right here, this is a control airway, control diet, meaning this mouse had not been fed any fiber. And this is a control also. And this picture is taken from a mouse airway that had been fed low fiber diets. And you can see how there is this much red coloring. The red color indicates immune cells in this area. And if there are immune cells in this area, then that means there is some kind of an inflammation or an allergic reaction happening. So this data shows us that the mice that have been on a low fiber diet contained more inflammation in their airways, right, than the mice that were fed high fiber diets. Because if you look at this airway, from a mouse who has been eating a high fiber diet, you see that there is way less red spots, right? Way less immune cells at this site, meaning way less inflammation. So according to this study that we looked at in class, a high fiber diet helps lower inflammation in mice who have airway allergic reactions due to asthma. Okay. Then we moved on to talk about IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. Now, IBS is a condition where there is no known cause, right? So it is, all we know about IBS is its symptoms, how it's characterized, and it's characterized by cramps, bloating, diarrhea, and constipation. But because we don't know what the cause of IBS is, there hasn't really been a treatment that is compatible for everyone with IBS. However, people have realized, and scientists have realized, that some types of saccharides that are fermentable oligosaccharides or disaccharides or monosaccharides or polyols, and the name for all of these collection of saccharides is FODMAPs. Scientists have figured out that FODMAPs, eating FODMAPs, sometimes causes the same symptoms that are found in IBS individuals, or in individuals who have IBS. And so there are diets for some individuals with IBS that have very low amounts of FODMAPs in it. And sometimes people who have IBS, if they completely avoid FODMAPs or they eat less of FODMAPs, then they feel better, right? Their symptoms are alleviated. However, there are, of course, people who have IBS and they avoid FODMAPs, but they still have the symptoms of IBS. So this isn't something that is true for every individual, because every person's gut microbiome and organism is different. However, for the purposes of this class, you should definitely know that the symptoms of ingesting FODMAPs in some individuals are compatible with the symptoms that some individuals with IBS have. And that is why, for some individuals who have IBS, completely avoiding FODMAPs that are a type of saccharides helps them alleviate their IBS symptoms. Hopefully that made sense. Then, in this lecture, we continued to talk about protein. Or I guess started to talk about protein. And let's look over here to see how protein is broken down and ingested, or digested and absorbed. So protein, which is a polypeptide, is further broken down to singular polypeptides. Then polypeptides are broken down to tripeptides, dipeptides, and amino acids. And all of these are absorbed into the cell of the small intestine. Once they are absorbed, every molecule, so the tripeptides and dipeptides, are broken down into amino acids. And the individual amino acids are absorbed into the blood, that blood capillary that is right next to the small intestine cell. And this way, amino acids travel through our blood, into our liver, and into our system. Now, there are a couple conditions that we talked about that are related to having lack of protein in a diet or having a deficiency of protein in the diet. Now, this portion of my notes is kind of messy, but I will go through it as best as I can. So, if an individual is deficient in protein, then they may experience, and it seems like most people do, they experience edema. Edema is a swelling of tissues in the limbs, primarily, and other parts of the body as well. And this happens because, and I drew it over here, but I will redraw it so that it makes sense. If you think about it, if this is a blood vessel, inside of the blood vessel, we have, let's say, many proteins, right? Let's say this individual is not deficient in protein. Now, if this individual isn't deficient in protein, then the protein in their blood vessel allows for water to come inside the blood vessel, because water follows solute. And because of this, now there's a lot of water in the blood vessel, the blood pressure is high, and everything's great, right? Everything's normal. Now, if the person is deficient in protein, let's go back to drawing our vessel again. If the individual has very few protein in their blood vessels, then water will be leaving the blood vessel because there is no oncotic pressure that keeps the water inside of the blood vessel. And you don't need to know that oncotic pressure. Because the water leaves the blood vessel, the water ends up going into the nearby tissue, and it swells the tissue up. And that swelling is called edema. Okay? Now, individuals who are deficient in protein can also, follow the arrow, can also experience inflammation in their large intestine. However, individuals who completely lack protein, they experience immune incompetence. Okay, so just the difference between deficient in protein and lack of protein. However, on the other side of the scale, right, eating too much meat, and especially too much red and processed meat, is associated with various diseases, such as diabetes, and overall in higher mortality. So definitely need to find a good balance between eating enough, right, within the recommended daily amount, and not over the recommended amount. Another topic that we touched upon was the myth of that vegan and vegetarian diets completely lack protein. And that is not true, right? Because there is definitely plant-based protein. Next, I also wanted to discuss gluten in this video, or in this chapter, although Professor Hampton went over gluten in lecture 6, but I'll just cover it here since I have the notes. Now, gluten is a polypeptide, and gluten can cause gluten sensitivity in some individuals, meaning individuals can have problems with their gut, and every time they consume gluten, they are overly sensitive to it, and an inflammatory response is sparked. Now, celiac disease is a form or a type of gluten sensitivity. There are other gluten sensitivities also. Let me retract that. Gluten sensitivity isn't only in the gut. Gluten sensitivity can be in other places of the body. I used to know somebody who was allergic to gluten, and when she ate gluten, she was unable to breathe properly, right? So that's one type of gluten sensitivity. Whereas celiac disease is a form of gluten sensitivity that takes place inside the gut. And you definitely don't need to know the details of this big structure or drawing, but the main idea is that if gluten is able to somehow pass the wall of the small intestine and get inside of the bloodstream and our system, there is a large inflammatory response that is sparked, and our own immune system ends up attacking the cells of the small intestine. the cells of the gut. So this is an autoimmune type of reaction that is happening because of gluten. And that is what celiac disease is. However, there is this condition called NCGS. And NCGS is gluten sensitivity in individuals who don't suffer from celiac disease. So there are people who avoid gluten. However, it's not because they have celiac disease. It is because of other reasons, right? It can be because it can be psychological, or it can be for other conditions that they may have. But just knowing that NCGS is gluten sensitivity in people who don't necessarily suffer from celiac disease, but they still avoid consumption of gluten. Okay, this is all I have for lecture 5. Definitely go through the lecture that Dr. Hampton gave and go over the recording, and make sure to pay attention at the terms list and the study list, because that's a very, very good tool, and that's where you will know what you will be tested on mainly. Okay, but hopefully this was a good overview, and it helps you see what you're missing, or what gaps you have in your knowledge. And my name is Lilith again, so please email me if you have any questions. I'll try to get back to you as soon as I can.